All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest series in our series of policy talks. I'm Andrew McLaughlin. I'm Google's Director of Public Policy, and we are very fortunate today to have the presence of Ronaldo Lemos from Brazil. He's a good friend, a great guy, one of the great internet activists in Latin America, and somebody who has done an amazing job of fighting for a free and open internet, for balance and copyright, for sanity and intellectual property laws, and for a strong and vigorous open source community. He's also a great guy, so I hope you all will stick around to get to know him afterwards. But in the meantime, without further ado, let me introduce Ronaldo Lemos.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure being here. This is such a short trip. I'm 2 days in California, so I'm flying back tomorrow. So my presentation is divided into 6 parts. I'll try to make it quick, so if people have questions, we can talk a little bit afterwards. The first part talks a little bit about something that is going on everywhere, and especially in developing countries. So I'll give you some examples from Brazil about cultural production, and you see that there is a big transformation in the cultural industry going on there. So if you consider the music business in the past 5 years, you see that the number of sales of physical units, that's DVDs and CDs, have been dropping significantly, and just like everywhere else. So we suffer from the same structural transformations. But more dramatic, if you take the largest record label in Brazil, which is Sony BMG. Sony BMG in 2006 released only 13 CDs of Brazilian music. So Brazilian is very well known for being like a musical country, and the largest record label in Brazil releases only 13 CDs per year. So that's not enough. If you take a look at the publishing business, like the newspaper business, once again, you take a look at the Folha de São Paulo, that's the largest newspaper in Brazil. You see very similar numbers. These are the daily circulation numbers for Folha de São Paulo. And you also can see a trend that the number of daily circulation is dropping, just like everywhere else. So it's the same trend. If you take a look at books in the publishing business, numbers about books in Brazil are somehow hard to get, but the trend is there as well. The numbers go up to 2003. So there's a drop in revenues coming out of the book industry in Brazil, just like the other ones. And finally, if you take a look at movies, then it's very interesting because Hollywood has 85% of the Brazilian market share, which is actually the global market share for Hollywood. So that's the same that happens in Brazil. And Brazil releases 352 films per year, but only 51 films are Brazilian movies. And if you take a look at the top 5 box office numbers in Brazil, you will see something like that. There are no Brazilian films at all in the top 5, and that's the general rule for movies there. And the same trend is also taking place. So if you take a look, in the 70s, there was a huge peak of movie making in Brazil. So the numbers of the public numbers was really high. But then you can see a trend for a decreasing number of audience for the movie business, just like you can see a decline trend for the revenues coming out of movies in Brazil. So these 2 graphs can show you that there's also a transformation in movie attendance in the country. That takes me to the second part of my presentation, which is at the same time that these structural challenges are taking place in the country because the consumers are changing their habits, they are getting information from different sources, something is happening, which is the collaborative production of culture and information. So the same Web 2.0 trend that you can see in the United States is also taking place in developing countries and also taking place in Brazil. So for instance, this is the Wikipedia website in Portuguese for Donald Rumsfeld. And it's very interesting because in the very date that Donald Rumsfeld resigned, I took a look at the page and it had been already updated. Someone took its time and went there and updated the page. That demonstrates interesting things. For instance, Brazilians have a lot of time to spare. That's one of the things that you can see. But also it demonstrates that there are people willing to contribute to information generation, like updating the web page at the Wikipedia of Donald Rumsfeld. Wikipedia is not the only example. So the rule is almost like that. Give me a cultural industry, and I'll show you a collaborative industry in a more or less developed state. So for the music industry, you have websites like Jamendo or Jamendo, like the French say. It's a French website for music. But in Brazil, you have like a similar one that is called Trama Virtual. This is a place where musicians can upload their songs basically for free. People can download them for free. You can listen to them online for free. And the number of artists that Trama Virtual have right now is 30,000. They have approximately 100,000 phonorecords available at their website. That's very different from the 13 albums that Sony BMG is releasing every year. So television, audiovisual, you have YouTube. But in Brazil, you have Videolog, which is the Brazilian version for YouTube. It's very interesting because if you talk with the guys that made Videolog, they swear that they had the idea before YouTube and they had it in place before YouTube. So they come up with the concept before YouTube. Too bad that they didn't let many people know about this in time. But the website is working fine. And it's interesting because some urban groups actually prefer to post their content at Videolog, for instance. Skateboarders, they like to post their video there. Like people who do le parkour, like the French climbing, building climbing sports, they actually use Videolog as the basis for disseminating their videos. So it plays an interesting symbolical role in the Brazilian society. It has its own place there as well. Well, if you have Flickr, in Brazil you have like 8P, which is a pictures community. It works very similarly to Flickr, and it's growing. And if you have websites like Newsvine, like citizenship journalism websites, in Brazil you have communities like Overmundo, which I am one of the founders actually. I'll get back to Overmundo later. But it's an example of Web 2.0 working in the country as well. And it's a very popular website. That takes me, one more example. In the book industry, if you have like open publishing initiatives like the Public Library of Sciences, which publish like academic journals and academic papers, in Brazil you also have a version of that which is Cielo. It's a portal where you can find the most important academic journals available for free online, and it's one of the most popular websites in Brazil as well. So the rule is that give me a cultural industry, I'll show you an open, collaborative alternative that is more or less developed in Brazil. Okay, part 3 of my presentation. So now I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about copyright law in Brazil, and I'm going to do that in 1 minute. I'll do the following. So let's ask a few questions about copyright law in the country. Can I include an MP3 of the famous Brazilian singer Caetano Veloso in my podcast? The answer is no. Can I include an MP3 of Caetano in my webcast? No. Can I include a song by famous singer Chico Buarque in a domestic video? No. Can I include a song by Chico Buarque in my weblog? No. Can I make a legal copy of a book or of a chapter of a book in Brazil? No. Can I copy the songs of a CD that I just bought in the store to my iPod? So I go to the store, I buy a CD, and I copy the CD to my iPod. Can I do that under Brazilian law? No. So can I remix a song, like from famous artist and minister of culture in Brazil, Gilberto Gil, if the song is not licensed under a public license like CC? No. And then the final question, which is there a right of private copy or the idea of fair use under the Brazilian law? And the answer to that is also no. So Brazil does not have fair use. It's a very complicated situation. We are working hard to try to change that, but that's the situation of the copyright law as it is. As a consequence of that, is the other part of my presentation, there is a natural tension between the two models, the traditional cultural industry and the collaborative cultural industry, which depends on the use of copyright of other people. So how do you do with that? How do you solve this problem? How can you build upon the works of other people? That's the prerequisite for the collaborative web to emerge. So basically, one way of answering one of the consequences of this situation is lawsuits. So the same wave of lawsuits that you see in the United States, for instance, record labels suing users in Brazil, file sharers, it's taking place in Brazil just the same. And more radical than that, like book publishers are suing universities, professors, and students on behalf of like people copying chapters of a book. So as you see, the situation in Brazil is pretty hard, and people are actually being sued because the law does not provide for the exceptions and limitations to copyright that it should provide. And so the situation is lawsuits. So the tension that is going on in the country is a tension between what is legal and what is illegal. And that's a tension that copyright law is not being able to solve right now. So the question is, how do you approach the collaborative production of culture if the copyright law does not give you enough fair use in order, for instance, to build upon the works of other people? So that's a question. And one way to solve this question is to discuss a little bit about the idea of legal commons. So the idea of commons, like in Creative Commons, is familiar to you, I hope. And the idea of commons would be as follows. So you have some pieces of information and culture that are actually, you do not have to ask permission to use. So for instance, one type of commons is the public domain works. So if you use works which are actually in the public domain, you do not have to ask permission in order, for instance, to put them online. So that's one sort of commons. The other type of commons would be the fair use rights. So if you are using like if you are taking a copy of one chapter of a book for private use, that would be fair use in the majority of countries. Unfortunately, it's not the case in Brazil, but that's another way of thinking about the commons. These are usages of information in which you do not have to get the permission to use. And the other type of commons would be licenses, like people actively, like authors and creators, actively saying to you that you can go ahead and use their works. So for instance, people can use the GNU Free Documentation License, which is used, for instance, at the Wikipedia, that allows anyone that publishes at Wikipedia are giving you a license to use their works. And you can use Creative Commons, which is another form of licensing, in which authors and creators let you know that you can do certain forms of use for their works. So this is what I call the legal commons, like using the legal system in order to provide access to your content. This is one of the strategies for dealing with collaborative production. Of course, there are many others. There are private licenses rather than public licenses. And there are other strategies by which you can deal with this problem as well. I call this strategy the legal commons strategy in comparison with another strategy that I would like to talk with you about, which is the idea of a social commons in parallel to an idea of a legal commons. And that's where my presentation gets really important. So everything that I said until now was not that important. Now things get really, really get important. So think with me a little bit. What do I mean by a social commons? By social commons, I mean situations in which intellectual property, like copyright, is either unknown, people simply don't know about it, or it's not enforced. Like even if you go to the court, sometimes you don't even have a court to go to enforce intellectual property. And sometimes intellectual property is simply irrelevant. People don't care about intellectual property because your business model does not require intellectual property in order to operate. So this is what I call the legal commons. And this, for developing countries, is a very familiar discussion because we are already used to this discussion about a formal organization of society versus like an informal way of organizing society. The boundaries between formality and informality are becoming each time more hard to be established everywhere else, but in the developing countries, this has been like this for at least, I don't know, 50 or 60 years. So this is a discussion that is very familiar to us. Okay, so once you understand the idea about the social commons, that's what I would like to point out. And there is something new happening, something that is extremely important, and that's what I would like to call your attention to. What is going on is the fact that the global peripheries, like the global places which are not in the center, like the margins, are appropriating technology. Technology is getting there, and the fact that technology is getting there is producing very important consequences to these people's lives. So I'll give you a few examples of how this is happening. The first example has to do with digital inclusion. So one might ask the question, do people in Brazil have access to computers? Is it possible to get access to the internet? And the answer to this is becoming more and more yes. And the reason for that is because people are getting access to the internet, not from their homes or schools, but through the so-called LAN houses. LAN stands for Local Area Network. So that means computers connected among themselves to play games. So like these are places where people would go to play Counter-Strike, Warcraft in a network. And then people are getting these places connected to the internet, and then broader communities, a larger group of people start to go there besides the game players. So like people just go there for the internet and not for the games themselves. This is a phenomenon in Brazil. A phenomenon in the sense that the majority of the people in the country nowadays get internet access not through their homes, but through LAN houses. Places that look very much like this. This is a picture of a LAN house. This is a picture of another LAN house. You can barely see that it's a LAN house because it's only like a banner there. And this is also a picture of a LAN house in a Brazilian favela. It's a very poor place. But if you look closely, they say LAN house, and they charge a very low price for internet usage or for games. So approximately 50 cents of a dollar per hour of using the internet or playing games, which is okay. Like Brazilians can afford that. Even like poor Brazilians can afford that. The interesting thing, this is another picture of a LAN house. The interesting thing is that the phenomenon started with games, but it went much beyond the gaming scene. So if you go to a LAN house today, I'll just show you this first, you will see that it's becoming a sort of a public space in which you can access like e-government services. So this is like what is the types of services that you can actually get in a LAN house, and you can pay your telephone bill, you can pay your light bill, electricity bill, you can renew your taxpayer number in a LAN house, because through the internet you can do all this stuff. So they're charging specifically, for instance, 50 cents of a dollar for you to pay your phone bill or to renew your taxpayer number, and so it goes. They even prepare a resume for you, and they charge you $1 for that. So like, if you take a look at down there, to send a curriculum, that's the Brazilian word for resume, they help you to write your resume, and they charge $1 for that. So that's the interesting thing. Like, it's changing the way people think about the internet. Recently, we did a research. This research was all over the country, And we could establish that from everyone that has internet access in Brazil, 22% of the population have access to the LAN houses. At home, it's only 19%. In the houses of friends and parents, friends, relatives is 16%, and at work is 13%. So the number one place is the LAN houses. And it's interesting because the younger the population, like people from 16 to 24 years, the larger the percentages are for LAN house usage. But you can see that people from all ages use them. It's just that younger people generally go more to LAN houses than older people. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's changing the landscape of internet access and usage in Brazil. And actually, one of the favorite activities of people at the LAN houses is Orkut. So if you go to any LAN house, you'll see all those blue screens because everybody's at Orkut at the same time. It's very interesting. Okay, so that's the first example. The second example is about the music industry. So I mentioned to you about Sony BMG, but if you go to the north of Brazil, in a state called Pará, it's really up north, there is a music scene, a musical scene called Tecnobrega. Techno means techno, you know, electronic beats, especially 80s electronic beats. Brega means kitsch or cheesy or techy. So it's a techno cheesy scene that is going on in the north of Brazil. It's very good for dancing. People generally dance together. So it's really cool. And this is extremely popular. And it's made with computers. And actually, every year, the Tecnobrega scene releases 400 CDs and actually 100 DVDs. So it's a very vibrant musical scene. But the interesting thing is, if you go to a store to buy these CDs, you won't find them. And the reason is that those CDs are delivered directly through the street vendors. You know, the same guys who sell the piracy stuff? Like the artists go there deliberately and give their CDs and say, please, distribute this as much as you want and you can charge as much as you want. So this is the way they use for disseminating their music and getting money back. And it's very interesting because the Tecnobrega scene involves a cult for technology. So the way they make money is throughout the so-called sound system parties. In Portuguese, we call them aparelhagens. And the sound system parties attract like 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people. And they're like big events. And the sound system, they actually compete among themselves to see who has the most cutting-edge equipment. So every year, you have a party in which the equipment comes, and then the equipment comes from the sky. Actually, it's very fun, and people clap for the equipment. So it's like a celebration for the new equipment coming that year. So here are some pictures of the Tecnobrega parties. As you can see, this is in a very poor area, very poor neighborhood of Brazil, but you can see that the equipment is not that bad, and like there's a lot of people dancing. This guy here is DJ Dinho. It's a famous DJ there. These are people in the party. The people doing the symbol of one specific sound system, which is called Super Pop. So this is the symbol of Super Pop. And this is the coming of the sound system. So this is the peak of the night, like where people go really crazy about it. Like it's the most important moment of the night. And this is the DJs of the party. And this is where the CDs are sold. Like the CDs are sold not in a regular store, but they are given to the street vendors by the artists so that the street vendors can distribute them. For 1 year, we did a research in that place in order to measure the economic value and the productive chain of the Tecnobrega. So we have all this information. And it's a multi-million market. People make a lot of money out of this. And I'm not going to go through the numbers right now, but if you want, I can send them to you. But I'll give you a very small, very quick description about how this market works. So we did both a qualitative research and a quantitative research to understand how this market works. So everything goes like this. You have the bands, the DJs, and the composers. They go to a recording studio. They pay the recording studio to record their songs, like a very low amount. And then they get the CDs and give the CDs directly to these distributors, these street vendors. The street vendors then sells the CDs, but they don't get the money that the street vendors got. So the public pays the street vendors, but there is no money going up from this stream. Then how do they get money? Like concert halls pay the artists. The more famous they get, more money they got from the concert halls. The sound system part is also, also pay them. So the money goes like this and like this. So the public paid this, pay these two players, and the money goes up. And there is an interesting thing that this is a financially leveraged market. This is something that we didn't know until we started our research. There is a guy who's the financial guy. He is the one that gives money to the sound systems to buy the expensive equipments, and then the guy gets either interests or he has an equity investment and gets like a part of the profits. So this guy there, what we call the party funder, is the guy that provides and puts money into the system. And the other thing that we found out is that even though the artists give their music to be sold in the streets, they also sell CDs and DVDs after the concerts. And this is a very important revenue for the artists. So they go, when people go to the concerts, you can buy a better quality DVD, a better quality CD with graphic materials, and actually people pay higher prices for that than what they pay in the streets. So in the streets, you just buy the CDs for approximately $2 or $3, but when you buy them in a concert, it's approximately $5 or $6 per CD, but it's a much more expensive, much more careful product, and they sell a lot of CDs after the concerts. So just to give you very quickly a few numbers. Each artist in this scene plays approximately 12 concerts per month. In each concert, they sell 77 CDs, and each CD is sold by approximately $6. So this is a very good revenue for an artist in Brazil, if you consider especially like the minimum wage in the region. So it's pretty good money. Okay. The important thing for us to know here is that the #1 artist in Brazil, the most famous one, come out of that scene and come out from that business model. So we did the research in Brazil, and we asked people to say, what is the music that you are listening to right now? That was the question. Like, you could say anything. 14% of the people said it was Calypso, which is a band that comes out of Tecnobrega, and it's a band that was made up by distributing their CDs through the street vendors. But the interesting thing is that from the top 10 bands, 2 other bands are in the same situation. So these are artists that are not signed with record labels. They are artists that were made by themselves, and they use these alternative forms of distributing their content in order to become famous. So, in other words, the most important and most famous artist in Brazil is a product of this scene. Okay, so the second example, very quickly, is the so-called Baile Funk, which is a scene that takes place in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. It's a completely different place. The interesting thing about Baile Funk is pretty much the same as the Tecnobrega scene. But what happens with Baile Funk is that it has become influential. Like, other artists besides Brazil, like beyond Brazil, started playing Baile Funk. So this is MIA, maybe some of you have heard of her. And everything that she does is pretty much inspired by the Baile Funk in Rio de Janeiro. And it's interesting because it's something that is done in the poorest neighborhoods of Rio, and it became somehow famous in some parts, other parts of the world. So it was. There's a funny story. I went to a store in Paris that is called Colette. It's a store that only sells curated things for cool people. So they only sell 100 CDs. if you buy one of those CDs, it's because you're a really cool guy, you know? And they charge $80 for each CD. So they only sell like 5 jackets, 10 pair of pants, like 100 CDs, and that's it. So it's a curated shop only for people that are really, really cool. And when I went there, and I took a look at the CDs, I was really surprised because out of the 100 CDs, 6 of them were Baile Funk CDs being sold for $80. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, that's really, really amazing. And the other thing is, this is the Wikipedia entry for Mia. It mentions her influence of Baile Funk. And the other part of the symbolical impact, for instance, this is The Guardian on a Sunday issue in the UK. And this guy is saying, Baile Funk might be the most exciting music in the world. So it's almost unbelievable for us Brazilians because this is coming from the poorest places in the country and somehow it's getting to other places and being recognized as an important cultural scene, at least a fun scene. So that's the example of Baile Funk. Let me talk a little bit about movies now. And that's also part of the research that we did in Brazil. I mentioned to you that Brazil releases 51 films per year, right? The United States releases 611 films per year, approximately. What's on top of that? Do you know? India. India releases 934 films. What's on top of that? No, it's not Hong Kong. Hong Kong is approximately 51, 52, just like Brazil. So, does anyone know? Nigeria. Nigeria releases 1,200 films per year. Films like Oswalfia in London or Oswalfia in London Part 2. The interesting thing of the Nigerian film scene is that they release 30 new titles per week directly to DVD. They shoot in digital video or high definition video. So one film costs approximately from $30,000 to $100,000 to be made. They sell it directly through the streets, just like the Tecnobrega scene. And Nigeria has 0 movie theaters. They don't even have 1 movie theater. And the other interesting thing, the films are sold for $3 each, or you can rent a film for 50 cents of a dollar. And it generates $200 million per year in revenues, making the Nigerian film industry the 3rd largest in the world. So in number 1, you have the United States really up there. Then you have India. Then you have Nigeria. And the most shocking information, it generates 1 million employments. So in Nigeria, the number 1 employment source is agriculture. The number 2 is cinema. And the number 3 is oil. So it's interesting that movies in Nigeria employ more people than oil. So it's a completely different way of doing the movie business. They even created like a satellite channel that is called Africa Magic. And it's the number 1 satellite channel in Africa. And it plays Nigerian movies 100% of the time. And it's the most popular channel. The films are being exported now to Tanzania, Uganda. It's been exported even to South Africa and the UK. And the guys really know what they are doing. Like we brought some of the Nigerian producers to Brazil. And the guys are really smart. They say things that you are really impressed, like about their business model. They know exactly the importance of digital technology, and they know their business. So it's a very interesting scene to keep an eye at. I mentioned this story to a very famous Brazilian director, and he told me, Ronaldo, this is not cinema. This is something else. This is, call it what you want, but this is not the true cinema. And then I was intrigued by that conversation, and I went and found an article by this guy, Henri Langlois, which is the founder of the French Cinémathèque. And he wrote in 1969 that the true cinema would only emerge when the global peripheries got access to the means of production of cinema and audiovisual audiovisual, and started to tell their own stories. When that happened, Henri Langlois says, then the true cinema would start to take place. And I got this article, and I sent the article to this very famous Brazilian director, and he never got back to me, so I don't know what he thinks about it. Okay, so this is all part of this project that is called Open Business. It's a project that takes place in Brazil, Nigeria, Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina. In each of these countries, you have different scenes. It's amazing because this is happening everywhere in the world. It's happening in all the global peripheries. And there is something important. When I say global peripheries, this is not something about the south and the north, the rich and the poor, or the center and the margins. Actually, the same thing goes on, for instance, in the mixtape markets in New York or London, in the dubstep scene or the grime scene in London. It's just the same way of do business. So it's not a thing that is happening in the developing countries. It's happening everywhere. In the United States, the hip-hop in Baltimore, the Baltimore scene of hip-hop is just like the same. It's based on mixtapes, and so it goes. And this is another way of doing business that actually challenges our ideas of intellectual property, for instance, because it's based in this idea of social commons, in which people really don't care, because intellectual property is not the most important factor here. People want their music to circulate. The more the people have access to that music, the more money that you can make out of that music that people are listening. So this represents the do-it-yourself generation taken to the last consequences. So this is what happens when technology gets to certain places very quickly, and the way it's changing people's lives in a very significant way. So I will conclude just by saying two things. The first is a research that we did in Brazil about how the Brazilians are inclined to contribute and to collaborate online, like to produce content and post that content online. And this was very interesting because from everyone that has internet access in Brazil, 42% say that they already contribute to the web, like posting songs, posting videos, posting pictures, writing in weblogs. So 42% of the Brazilians actually contribute to the internet. And when we ask, what's the reason? Why do you contribute? Why do you create content yourself and you post it online? People answer, 33% of the answers would be to establish relationships with other people and with friends. So the important thing is content production becomes a form of establishing relationships with other people. So you contribute in order to relate to other people, and that's important for Brazilians. You might have heard that the Brazilians are number one in time of internet usage per month. So Brazilians top the people in the United States by 4 hours actually per month, and tops the people in Europe, I think, by 6 hours per month. So the Brazilians really love technology. They love to be online. And from what we've been finding out, they love to collaborate and to produce content as well. Last thing, then I'll finish. This project that I was engaged, which is called Overmundo, is a platform for people to produce content about the Brazilian culture. So this website is only focused in the Brazilian culture. 100% of the content is produced by the users, but the users also edit the content. They decide what is going to be published or not. So there is a voting system which is similar to Dig, but it's not like, doesn't work like Dig, in which you are only published at the website if you get voted enough. And it became the largest and most popular Web 2.0 community in Brazil, and it talks about culture. That's very interesting because in many other places, the most important Web 2.0 websites become like the technology sites. Like these are the first comers, like they are the first that become popular. In Brazil, no. In Brazil, the cultural website became the #1 Web 2.0 website. And actually, it received the Prize Ars Electronica, the Golden Nika, in Austria this year. Like 2 years ago, Wikipedia got it, and 4 years ago, Creative Commons got it, and this year, like Overmundo got it. And one of the reasons is that it's based on free software. So anyone can get the Overmundo code and, for instance, create their own website. So the website of iCommons today is based on the Overmundo code. And very interestingly, this website in Brazil, which is called the Public Safety Forum, it's a Web 2.0 community for police officers, in which people discuss, well, can I use handcuffs or not? You know, but they discuss these issues from a bottom-up perspective. Like the website is about human rights, but instead of introducing the discussion from top down, you just let like police officers and other officers dealing with public safety to discuss it from the bottom up. So my final conclusion is these tools, like collaborative tools, Web 2.0 tools, they're very important and they are reappropriated in developing countries with a very different meaning. So the meaning of the Web 2.0 and the collaborative web in Brazil sometimes can be completely different from the meaning that you see about it in the United States or in Europe. So we are really appropriating these technologies to try to solve local problems, for instance, the visibility of the Brazilian culture, public safety issues, because we really think these are tools connected with development. So this is a chance of development, and we indeed believe that this is important for the way that we build the information society from now on. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ronaldo. That was a fantastic presentation. Very thought-provoking, as always. And I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question. But for anybody that wants to ask a question, the mic is there. And since we're recording, please do use the mic. Let me ask you, as a starting question, to connect the first half of your presentation first quarter about copyright with all of the things that are going on underneath all of those no's that came up under Brazilian copyright law. So, in other words, is it the case that people are not enforcing those laws in ways that stop the activities you're trying to promote, that there's an informal sector, or is there something else going on?
Right. Okay. That's a very interesting question, because what happens is copyright law as it is right now in Brazil is a challenge for the collaborative culture, because it doesn't give you the answers. All that it says is the general rule, which is the authors have the exclusive rights to authorize the usage of their works, and that's it. So there is no exceptions to that general rule that would allow, for instance, for a consistent collaborative web to emerge. So what happens out of that is that you have to solve all the problems through the licensing terms. And these licensing terms, they change, they are very different. So for instance, you have the YouTube model in which you give non-exclusive rights to YouTube. So the fact that you post your content at YouTube does not prevent you from posting it in other websites. But in Brazil, you have collaborative websites which demand exclusive rights from you. So that means if you post the content in my website, I own your content and you cannot post it anywhere else. So if you think about this from a collaborative perspective, as a long-term strategy, I think it's very difficult to build a community based on terms like this. So the first thing is these problems are being solved through licensing. The second thing is, at the same time that the Brazilian law is strict, then you have this other universe, which is the universe that I call the social commons. And in this universe, copyright law, intellectual property, it's so complicated, it's so alien, it's so out there that like people simply don't know that it exists, or they don't care if it exists, or they know that it's not going to be enforceable. So in these circumstances, in which you cannot rely on copyright law, what is happening is that business models are emerging. So for instance, the entire Tecnobrega scene, the people know that they cannot rely on copyright to enforce exclusive rights. So what do they do about it? They use this social situation in order to take profit out of it and to create a business model that is completely compatible with that social circumstance. So there is an article that I'm writing with a Brazilian anthropologist that is being called The Globalization of Informality. And what I'm saying in this article is that the situation of a social commons is becoming more and more globalized. Because when you think about peer-to-peer networks, BitTorrent, Pirate Bay, these are places in which intellectual property is not a relevant factor. And these are places in which a social commons has been emerged. And the idea, what a scene like Tecnobrega or the Nigerian film scene asks you is, how can you profit from this social commons environment, and how do you create business which are compatible with the social circumstances that take place in fact? So I think that's the perspective.
So it sounds like you're saying the informality of Brazil and other developing countries has allowed the flexibility for these models to change in a way that they haven't been allowed to change, in the United States and other places. Is it your hope or expectation, do you think that will be able to serve as sort of a proof of concept of something that can eventually help change, move along in more developed economies? And, because on the one hand, I can see how, say an artist like MIA
right.
Is able to still, work as an artist under that different model. So I could see how that could create change, maybe if artists were to catch on to it as a proof of concept. But on the other hand, I'm thinking sort of the powers that be are perhaps still going to lose out. The record labels in the United States aren't really part of that picture. So even if there's another system that works, do you think that our system can change if the status quo has to lose something?
Right. Yes. I think that these things that are happening, like the Tecnobrega, Nigerian film scene, they can show some possibilities for new business models that in general are not being taken into account when you discuss, for instance, the music industry. So in other words, I believe that there are lessons that could be learned by studying these models. The question is, how much can they be universalized, or how much they are the product of a local context? And this is a challenge that you have to face. And also, even the question of informality, I believe it's a challenge. This is a challenge for us, but it's a challenge that you can approach it in two different perspectives. You can simply repress it, so you can increase like policial resources, you can increase repression, or you can learn what's going on the economic terms and try to change the law, for instance, in order to accommodate or improve the law to also include these other possibilities and not only one possibility, which is the one, for instance, that the record labels advocate in Brazil. As for the second question, which is, sorry, could you remind me? Okay, that's very important. The second question is, so what happens if the record labels go there and offer them deals, for instance? If they go to a Tecnobrega artist and say, no, you became successful, so now here's a deal, let's work together. And the interesting thing is that has already happened. So for instance, Calypso, this band that is really famous, they got an offer from a record label, one of the multinational ones, and they refused. And the reason they refused is because they will make more money if they are not signed with the record label than they would make money if they are signed by the record label. And the other interesting thing is that when I presented the crisis through which the cultural industry is going on in Brazil, the record labels have failed in terms of disseminating the Brazilian culture. So there's a very clear failure. Like 13 CDs per year is not enough. Like Trama Virtual, in which people put their songs for free, have already 100,000 phonorecords. So there is a perception in Brazil that the traditional industry has failed. And now what we are doing is we are searching for the alternatives. And the first alternatives that are coming up, like test-proved, is precisely these things that are happening, like the Tecnobrega and other musical scenes like forró, che music, or the Kwaito music in South Africa, the Kuduro music in Angola, the Mizansi house in South Africa, the reggaeton in Puerto Rico, and so it goes. So it's really a global thing going on in which alternatives are emerging, not from the mainstream, but from the peripheries.
Do you think this might threaten industries with higher barriers to entry in terms of copyright and intellectual property? Like, for example, music, one could argue, is relatively low barrier to entry. All you need is some talent and a recording device. Right. But, for example, the software industry, you know, a piece of software might take, you know, millions or tens of millions of dollars to produce. And I know you mentioned that the movie industry is sort of maybe a step in the middle, but how do you see this affecting industries, intellectual property industries that have higher barriers to entry?
Excellent question. The Brazilian government is very much in favor of free software and open source software. And one of the reasons is precisely that. It's not a matter of cost, because sometimes the so-called total cost of ownership of open source software is actually higher than the cost of a proprietary system. But it's precisely what you mentioned. If you create an environment in which there is openness, in which open source is available, like libraries of code based on open source licenses are available, the entry barriers are much lower than in an environment in which everything is protected and everything is unavailable. So one of the structural things about this is the following. Brazil and the majority of the developing countries, we have missed all the important waves of development that took place before. So for instance, we missed the industrial wave in the beginning of the last century. We missed that completely. We missed the semiconductors wave of development in the 70s. So Brazil doesn't have any factory of semiconductors. And now there is a perception that there is a new wave of development that is possible, which is throughout information technology. So one of the ways that we see that is possible for us to participate in this wave of development is through open standards and open software, precisely because they make the entry barriers much lower. Like it's much easier to operate and to building something new using like open libraries than if you have to build code from scratch, which is the case if you don't have those libraries accessible.
All right. Please join me in thanking Ronaldo for this terrific talk. Thank you.